If you've opened a newspaper in the last week, you might have noticed that something just a bit big happened. Tucker Carlson, the famous and pretty controversial journalist, sat down for a chat with none other than Vladimir Putin, the very, very controversial leader of Russia. The interview itself was quite the long-winded thing, running for a total of 2 hours, 7 minutes, 18 seconds. And with a length like that, it's quite the daunting thing to have to sit through. So, we've done it for you. In the next 20 or so minutes, we're going to explain what it was all about. And another quick note just before we begin, this isn't going to be a video that wags its finger and tuts its tongue at those involved. What we're interested here today in is facts, so that you, the viewer, can render your own moral judgments. We don't need to moralize for you. You can do that yourself, so let's go. Now, the interview began with a 23-minute-long monologue by Putin on Russian and Ukrainian history. This appears not to have been pre-planned either by Carlson nor Putin, as it came as an ad hoc response from Putin after he believed himself to be misquoted by Carlson, within seemingly delivering the monologue with the intention of giving Carlson, and presumably the audience, a comprehensive explanation of the backgrounds of the current Russia-Ukrainian war, discussion of which was to form the bulk of the interview. Now, see for yourself what sparked the monologue.
On February 22nd, 2022, you addressed your country in a nationwide address when the conflict in Ukraine started. And you said that you were acting because you had come to the conclusion that the United States, through NATO, might initiate a, quote, surprise attack on our country. And to American ears, that sounds paranoid. Tell us why you believe the United States might strike Russia out of the blue. How did you conclude that?
Well, it was not about that the United States wanted to surprisingly strike Russia. I didn't say so. Is it a talk show or is it a formidable, serious talk that we're having?
Here's the quote. Thank you. It's a formidable, serious talk.
It's a serious talk, okay. You are trained in history, as far as I know.
Yes.
So I'll allow myself, like, to spend a minute to give you a reference note, a debriefing, if you don't mind that.
Please.
And well, that 30 seconds turned into 23 minutes, and we won't worry too much about the actual contents of that monologue, because it's exactly what you would imagine it to be, a more or less grounded in fact summary of Russian and Ukrainian history with a very, and we stress, very here pro-Russian bias. It's simple enough stuff. But this aspect of the interview has gotten a lot of coverage in the media, and many outlets were eager to throw in charged verbs such as rant when describing it. Now, such a verb may well be appropriate, but we've got no interest in spoon-feeding that take to you. We'd rather show you firsthand and allow you to draw your own conclusions. For what it's worth, Carlson himself addressed this tangent when he was introducing the interview, saying the following on the matter.
Honestly, we thought this was a filibustering technique and found it annoying and interrupted him several times. And he responded he was annoyed by the interruption. But we concluded in the end, for what it's worth, that it was not a filibustering technique. There was no time limit on the interview. We ended it after more than 2 hours.
So, was Putin's tangent sincere? Well, we're not going to answer that. You tell us. So after that, they moved on to discuss NATO expansion, as Putin also describes a claimed sense of disillusionment with the West following the collapse of the Soviet Union, particularly emphasizing the expectation from Russia that the dissolution of the Soviet Union would lead to a cooperative relationship with the West. Summarizing this best is the following extract. Here it is.
They also thought that Russia, voluntarily, of its own volition, decided to dissolve the Soviet Union, thinking that the civilized West, as it were, would see that as an invitation to friendship and alliance. That is what Russia was expecting from the US and the collective West as a whole.
He then goes on to claim that despite that early Russian optimism, the West's actions diverged from those expectations, chiefly because NATO expanded eastward, contrary to assurances that it wouldn't, leading to tensions reminiscent of the Cold War, but now closer to Russia's borders. To evidence this, he cites Egon Bahr, a contemporary MP in the Bundestag, and says the following.
And he said if NATO would expand, then it would be back during the Cold War, but only closer to Russia's border. He was very smart, but no one listened to him.
Putin then goes on to claim that China has to deal with the same supposedly hostile fear from the West as Russia does, the claim originating from an assertion to the contrary by Carlson, as you'll now see.
But you've never explained why you think that happened, except to say that the West fears a strong Russia, but we have a strong China the West does not seem very afraid of. What about Russia, do you think, convinced policymakers they had to take it down?
The West is afraid of a strong China more than it fears a strong Russia, because it's just 150 million people in Russia and it's 1.5 billion people in China, and also China's economy is growing at more than 5% a year. So the potential is enormous. Bismarck used to say the most important thing is the potential, and China potentially is the biggest economy in the world in terms of purchasing parity.
Now, Putin then closes the section by criticizing the West for breaking promises and alienating Russia, particularly through actions in Yugoslavia against Serbia, and accuses the West of abandoning international law and principles when it suits their interests, and then re-embracing them when the tide changes, further straining relations. Now, listen to him say it now.
But what did the US do? In violation of international law and the UN Charter, they started bombing Belgrade and the US, and it was the US that let the gin out of the bottle. Moreover, when Russia was indignant, when it was protesting, it was told that the international law and the UN Charter had become obsolete. Right now they're all referring to international law, but back then they were saying that the international law was obsolete.
From there, Putin goes on to recount his interactions with American leadership regarding Russia's potential integration into Western institutions such as NATO and broader security collaborations. Initially, Putin recounts an alleged conversation with President Bill Clinton where he inquired about Russia joining NATO, to which he claims Clinton initially responded positively, but later retracted after consulting his team. So, let's take a look at what was said now.
There was a meeting here in the Kremlin with the outgoing President of the US, Bill Clinton. We sat in the room next door, and I told him, Bill, what do you think? If Russia asked to be admitted into NATO, do you think it would happen? He said, it's interesting. I think yes. But in the evening, when we had another meeting for dinner, he said, I've talked to my team, no. Not going to happen, not now. So you can ask him. I think he'll watch this interview. I wouldn't have said anything like that if it hadn't happened.
Were you sincere? Would you have joined NATO?
Listen, I asked a question. I said, is it possible? And the answer was no.
But if he had said yes, would you have joined NATO?
If he'd said yes, then the process of rapprochement would have commenced, and it might have happened in the end if there were some sincere wish on this side of our partners, but it didn't happen.
Putin, pushed by Carlson, then goes on to reflect on the broader issue of why the West has maintained a hostile stance towards Russia post-Cold War, suggesting that the West perceives Russia as too large and independent-minded to be easily influenced or controlled. Through all of this, Putin presents a narrative in which Russia has faced repeated US presidents that acted amenable to cooperation only to be undercut by their administrations or renege on their initial openness, reinforcing Putin's perception of a systematic reluctance within the US political establishment to engage Russia as a genuine partner. And, well, with that said and done, they moved on to discuss the issue: Ukraine. Now, when it comes to Ukraine, there is only one question we want to hear the answer to. Why did Putin invade? Carlson puts this question to Putin, in response to which he claims a multifaceted rationale behind the decision, framing it as a defensive response to a series of calculated Western provocations and strategic encroachments that threatened Russia's national security and core interests. He identifies the eastward expansion of NATO as a primary concern, viewing it as a direct challenge to Russia's geopolitical stability and a breach of post-Cold War assurances that NATO would not extend its presence to Russian borders. This expansion, according to Putin, symbolizes the West's disregard for Russia's security concerns and its intent to isolate and weaken Russia. And here it is in his own words.
In 2008, they opened doors of NATO to Ukraine. In 2014, a coup d'etat was perpetrated with their help, and this was a coup d'etat, and those who did not recognize this coup d'etat were persecuted, and they created a threat to Crimea and had to take Crimea under our protectorate. They began warfare in Donbass, applying artillery and aviation against civilians in Donbass. We have the footages with fighter jets bombing Donetsk, flying over that, and they had a major military operation. They failed and had another one and another one. Against the backdrop of military development of that territory of NATO and open doors of NATO. So we actually had to express our concerns, otherwise it would be negligence, criminal negligence on our part. It would have been criminal negligence, because the American leadership, political leadership, drove us to the borderline that we could not overstep, and that would destroy Russia, and we had to support our creed mates, our faith mates.
Mixed within that extract, we see another of Putin's justifications for invading Ukraine, besides the perceived NATO encroachment on his borders, the threat to Crimea, and the war in Donbass, which he referred to, the idea that ethnic Russians were being persecuted in Ukraine. So, well, is there actually any truth to that claim? I mean, in truth, yeah, maybe, but it's a real stretch. It honestly depends on your own subjective definitions. The most you can really find hard evidence for is some limited scale minimization or erasure, depending on your perspective, of non-Ukrainian language in the country, such as the Ukrainian parliament voting in 2014 to repeal the 2012 law on the principles of the state language policy, which allowed the use of minority languages in courts, schools, and other government institutions in areas of Ukraine where the national minorities exceed 10% of the population. The repealing of this law was then vetoed by acting President Turchinov and remained on the books until 2018, when it was declared unconstitutional by the Constitutional Court and repealed. This repealing was then followed by a new law in 2019 called the On Supporting the Functioning of the Ukrainian Language as the State Language Law, which mandated Ukrainian in more than 30 spheres of public life. Note, however, this law did not regulate private communication, and some exemptions were allowed for the official languages of the European Union and for minority languages, with the exclusion of Russian, Belarusian, and Yiddish. This was criticized by both the Venice Commission and Human Rights Watch at the time, and in 2023 the law was amended to fix the issue. This is as bad as the repression gets, at least from the sources that we have available. Does this represent repression sufficient as to change the moral weighing of Putin's invasion of Ukraine? Well, again, up to you. We just want to give you the facts and you can render an informed verdict. But after explaining all of that, Putin then moved on to elaborate on the wider geopolitical and diplomatic backdrop that, according to him, necessitated Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Specifically, he points to the failure of the Minsk agreements, which were brokered to end the conflict in eastern Ukraine that has been raging since 2014.
This actually acted as a trigger to the recent development, and with respect to the recent development, the leadership of Ukraine stated they would not abide by the Minsk Accords that were signed after the developments of 2014 in Minsk, with a plan laid out for peaceful settlement in Donbass. And the today's Ukrainian leadership, their foreign minister and other officials and the president said they didn't like a thing about the Minsk package of measures, and they would not stick to them. And the former leaders of France and Germany said that around a year ago, said in public, worldwide, that they had signed that agreement, but they had not been going to execute to fulfill that. You know, they pulled our leg
Now, for some context here, the Minsk agreements outlined steps to facilitate a ceasefire, including the withdrawal of heavy weapons, release of hostages, restoration of control of the state border to the Ukrainian government, and provisions for local elections in Donetsk and Luhansk regions. They also called for constitutional reform in Ukraine to decentralize power and provide special status to the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Putin is not wrong to say that the Minsk agreements fell apart, but to lay the blame entirely at Ukraine's feet certainly seems disingenuous, as frankly, come the 2020s, the earlier goodwill to implement them, at face value at least, was long gone from both sides. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky said that he had no intention of talking to terrorists in regard to the Donbass separatists in 2021, a sentiment that was echoed by his subordinates such as Alexei Danilov, Secretary of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, who said that, quote, the fulfillment of the Minsk agreements means the country's destruction. When they were signed under the Russian gun barrel and the Germans and the French watched, it was already clear for all rational people that it's impossible to implement those documents. End quote. As for the Russians, they repeatedly refused high-level talks come 2020, a sentiment best summarized by former President Dmitry Medvedev, who published a Kremlin-endorsed article titled "Why It Is Senseless to Deal with the Current Ukrainian Leadership" in 2021. The rest of the discussion on the outbreak of the war is pretty much just more of this. So now, let's move on to discuss the next point of discussion in the interview. So remember the Nordstream pipeline? That was the one that got blown up back in September of 2022 and has been the source of much speculation ever since. Putin is very clear about who he thinks did it. And this sparks a dialogue with Carlson on the matter. Take a look.
Who blew up Nord Stream?
You did.
I was busy that day. Nate, do you have I did not blow up Nord Stream. Thank you, though.
У вас лично, может быть, есть алиби.
Well, personally, you might have an alibi, but CIA doesn't have one.
Do you have evidence that NATO or the CIA did it?
Вы знаете, я не буду вдаваться в
Well,
детали.
I'm not going to go into detail, but as they say, you've got to search for someone who had interest in that. And in this particular case, you have to search not just for someone who is interested in that, but also someone who has the capabilities, because there are many people who are interested in that, but, not everyone is capable of scouring the bottom of the Baltic Sea.
But I'm confused. I mean, that's the biggest act of industrial terrorism ever, and it's the largest emission of CO2 in history. Okay, so if you had evidence, and presumably given your security services, your intel services, you would, that NATO, the US, CIA, the West, did this, why wouldn't you present it and win a propaganda victory?
В войне пропаганды очень сложно победить.
Well, it's very difficult, to achieve a propaganda victory, because the US controls all the global media. And as far as many European media are concerned, the end beneficiary in many cases are American funds, foundations.
Unfortunately, there isn't much digging we can do around this to verify or debunk, as the case may be, as we simply don't know for sure who blew up Nord Stream, and from publicly available information, anyone who does claim to know is just lying to you. Denmark, Germany, and Sweden have all launched investigations into the explosions, with the Swedish one having already been terminated due to jurisdictional limitations, and the German and Danish ones are still underway. So we may know soon, but for now, we don't. Of course, like Putin says, he may well shine a light on the fact that the US did it, but we've checked Russian state news agencies and we've yet to see this evidence that he supposedly has and just can't wait to get out to a Western audience. And then there is one last point of note that we need to cover, and that's a discussion over Evangersovitz, an American who was arrested in 2023 on suspicion of espionage. Tucker opens the dialogue by saying the following.
I appreciate all the time you've given us. I just got to ask you one last question, and that's about someone who's very famous in the United States, probably not here, Evangersovitz, who's the Wall Street Journal reporter. He's 32, and he's been in prison for almost a year. This is a huge story in the United States, and I just want to ask you directly, without getting into the details of it or your version of what happened, if as a sign of your decency, you would be willing to release him to us and we'll bring him back to the United States.
Long story short here, Putin says no and doesn't hand him over to Carlson, but he doesn't close the door to the idea, saying the following.
Мы столько сделали жестов доброй воли.
Well, we've done so many gestures of goodwill out of decency that I think we've run out of them.
Аналогичными жестами ни разу не.
Because we've never seen anyone reciprocate to us in a similar manner. But on the whole, we are willing to talk. We do not rule out
Не исключаем того, что мы можем это
that
сделать
we
при
can do that
встречном движении со стороны
if there is movement
как бы партнеров
to accommodate us on the other side. And when I talk about the partners, I'm talking about our special services, and the special services are in contact with one another. They are talking about this subject. There is no taboo on discussing this issue. It can be solved, and we're willing to solve it. But there are certain terms
которые
that need to be
по партнерским каналам
met that are discussed via special services channels. I think an agreement can be reached.
I believe an agreement can be reached. And from there, the interview pretty much ends. Carlson and Putin have some limited discussion on Putin's lack of willingness to surrender, but otherwise, that's it. And the interview ends on cordial terms. So there you have it, the interview of the century. This ultimately has been a short and sweet overview. We are, after all, condensing a 2+ hour interview into 20 minutes. But so long as you finish this video with a good grounding of the interview and its contents, well, we're pretty happy. If you want to watch the full thing, and frankly, we would recommend it because no matter what you think of the people involved, it's a fascinating watch. You can find it for free on both Tucker Carlson's YouTube channel and his personal website. And thanks for watching.